This video is all about performance variables. Now, this is not a new term to us. I introduced the idea of performance variables in a previous video about the ACSF, where I just sort of dangled the carrot out there and gave you a bit of an insight into what this is about. Let's dive into some of the detail. So with performance variables, it's a key feature of the ACSF, and it recognises that there's 4 factors that may influence an individual's performance at any point in time across any of the core skills. So these 4 performance variables are what we use to help us measure the ACSF levels. And remember, we measure the ACSF levels for each of the 5 core skills independently. That is, reading has its own core skills, writing, oral communication, numeracy, and learning. And we measure them each independently, and the way we measure them is using these performance variables, these 4 performance variables. Now we can see them all listed across the top of the columns here. So we've got support, context, text complexity, and task complexity. And to break it down into something a little bit more obvious, with support, level 1, which we know is a low ACSF level, a low performance level, is basically where they need full support. So they need a lot of help. If people need a lot of help in undergoing tasks, in performing duties, in undertaking their responsibilities, then if they need full support, it's level 1. At the other extreme is where they're independent and they can work independently without much supervision. That would be somebody who scores ding ding level 5 in terms of the performance variable of support. Next on the list is context. And context, if it's highly familiar, if the scope of what's being examined is very, very familiar to our assessment candidate, then it's level 1. On the other hand, if it's not familiar at all, if it's a broad range of familiarity or they're not familiar with it at all, then that's going to be 5. If they can still get the task done, if they can still perform their responsibilities, even though there's a broad range of possibilities, that's your level 5 candidate. With text complexity, if the text is short and simple, level 1. If it's highly complex, then you're looking at 5. With task complexity, if it's concrete, few tasks, simple tasks, not too difficult, then it's going to be level 1. But if it's highly conceptual, a blend of multiple tasks in a melting pot all together, very random, ever-changing all the time, that's when you're going to be looking at your level 5. So you can see that there's a scale here between 1 and 5 for the ACSF levels based upon these 4 performance variables. Now let's just break them down. We've got slides for each of these. With support, level 1, we are aware they need full support. Level 5, that's somebody who's very independent. The question is, what support might a learner get on the road to independence? How do we help them move from level 1 through to level 5? And there's a few ways we can do that. For somebody who's close to level 1 support, we might demonstrate things to them. We might show them things one step at a time so they can copy and mimic what we're showing them. With a little bit more independence, they might be able to just take advice from experts instead of needing the demonstrations. Further along the road, maybe they just need some mentoring and occasional support, or even just a technical manual. Let's just give them a manual and they can do it themselves. And even one step further than that, don't give them a manual, just give them access to a help desk for when they occasionally need support, when they see something that's unfamiliar and they haven't seen it before. Can you see how we're moving from left to right there? We're moving from somebody who requires full support through to somebody who's quite independent, and as a result, that's reflected in the ACSF level of either 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. With context, again, highly familiar context. If somebody can only work in an area that they're very, very familiar with. So, for example, let's say they've been trained at a KFC and they can only do work at a KFC. If you put them into another type of store, they'd feel really, really lost. Then that's maybe a level 1 person. But somebody who can adapt to working at KFC or another type of shop, or even a different type of environment that might not even be takeaway food, then that's somebody who's more likely to be level 5. Of course, for most people, they're somewhere in the middle. It all relates to the prior knowledge or experience that a person brings to the situation. They might be 1, they might be 5, they might be somewhere in the middle. Next, let's talk about the complexity of text and complexity of task, because these are easy to combine because they both deal with complexity. And the term text, let's just narrow that down. It's used broadly to include written text, diagrams, visuals and oral text, and real-life objects and materials. So it's not just English, not just written language, whether it's English or French or whatever. It recognises that learners encounter, use and interpret multimodal texts in work, study and everyday life. So text, the definition of text, is a little broader than perhaps we would intuitively think. With respect to complexity of text and task, the components of text and task complexity are derived from research by Kirsch and Mosenthal in 1990 and research again by Kirsch in 2001, and they argue that a number of variables interact to determine the level of difficulty of information processing tasks. What this essentially means is that as we have a number of variables, as we have a lot more varieties, we have a lot more complexity, it makes it a lot more difficult for people to interpret text and interpret and complete tasks. The task difficulty increases as the length and complexity of the text increases. And here's an example of that. We've got a recipe book here for 3 and 4 ingredient recipes. It's easy. That's the way the book is marketed. It's just 3 or 4 ingredients. Anyone can handle it. However, the alternative is to contact our friend Heston Blumenthal and get onto the Big Fat Duck cookbook. And he has very, very precise and complicated recipes. Now, the task difficulty is so much more difficult if you're interpreting Heston's book as opposed to the 3 and 4 ingredients book. Somebody with an ACSF level for task complexity of 1 or 2 or 3 is likely to be able to handle the 3 and 4 ingredients recipe book, but you're probably going to need level 4 or 5 to be able to interpret Heston's book. Similarly, task difficulty increases as the type of process or kind of information required to respond to a question about a text increases in complexity. So, for example, we've got a relatively simple book here. We've got a novel with the unusual title of Why Water is Wet. I don't really know where that name's coming from, but it's a novel and it's a good bookseller apparently. But that's going to be a little bit more simple than if we're sitting there studying a variety of university-type textbooks. The task difficulty is going to be much more difficult if we've got a variety of books, especially if they have a higher academic standard and are written in a way that's involves a lot more research and a lot more challenge than a novel called Why Water is Wet. Task difficulty also increases as the degree of inference the reader is required to make increases. So what that means is if we have to be able to read behind the lines, if we have to be able to show a little bit more thought and really look in behind the written text and interpret what's there to draw conclusions, then that's way more difficult. I hope this video has been very helpful to you.